All opposed? That's passed. Thank you. Our first order of business is the procedural bylaw amendment to allow us to have a virtual council meeting. We need that. So the motion is that a bylaw to amend bylaw 2020-001, being a bylaw to govern and regulate the proceedings of the council of the city of Kawartha Lakes, be read a first, second, and third time, passed, numbered, signed, and the corporate seal attached. So if somebody wants to move and second it, then we can see if there's any questions. Councillor Yeo, you'll move that. Councillor Seymour Fagan, you'll second that. Is there any questions regarding the bylaw? Councillor Dunn, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Section or subsection 5-06 brackets 4 makes it so that during these types of meetings, during virtual meetings, no member of the public shall be allowed to present a deputation. I don't have a problem for this meeting, obviously, but I think going forward that if in fact we have more of these virtual meetings, deputation should be allowed.
I agree. I wonder if the clerk can give us any clarification on the procedural bylaw. I was under the assumption that a virtual meeting, we can have a public meeting at some point and members of the public can participate even though it's virtual. Can you give us clarification on that, Madam Clerk?
Yeah, so the, can I be heard?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, good. So the purpose of this amendment to the procedural bylaw is under the Emergency Measures Act to allow for council to go ahead and have a virtual meeting. Once our declaration of emergency is removed, this bylaw amendment is no longer in effect and we convert back to our previous procedural bylaw. So the May 26th meeting is our next scheduled council meeting. And depending on whether we're still in a state of emergency or not, it may or may not be held virtual. If it is, we can make those provisions to have public participation. At this point in time, because of the social distancing and not allowing anyone to congregate, we would only receive deputations at that meeting by correspondence. However, there is no provision for the public to participate in a Zoom meeting as it stands.
Councillor Dunn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the clerk, and I think that's the whole point. There's no reason with Zoom meetings why a member of the public can't make a presentation just like we do. They could be admitted for the portion of the meeting, and then they could be unadmitted. But they'd be and then they'd be subject to questions and answers from the members of council. It could all be done by Zoom without actually having to have them in presence.
We'll get clarification on that for the next meeting, Councillor, before the next meeting. If we have to amend the bylaw further, we can do that for the next meeting. What this does is it gives us, under a provincial or local state of emergency, it gives us the right to have a quorum by Zoom. It gives us a right to vote by Zoom, and it allows us to go into closed session. So it's really going to depend on the state of emergency and where we are for the next meeting. But we'll get clarification on that. And if we have to make an adjustment, we will do that, depending on whether we're under a state of emergency or not. So any other questions regarding the procedural bylaw? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Anybody opposed? Seeing none, Councillor Ashmore, you're opposed? Okay, that's passed. Thank you. Item 3, so there's a follow-up motion I want to put through, or I'll request council to move in second, that staff be requested to review and provide recommendations to council for the appropriate changes to the procedural bylaw to allow for electronic meetings by council, boards, and committees post state of emergency. And if somebody wants to move and second that, that's to come back at the next council meeting. Councillor O'Reilly, you'll move that. Thank you. Councillor Yeo, you'll second that. I'll just offer some clarification on that, that is post state of emergency, which will allow a counselor, if for some reason they can't attend in person to a regular council meeting, they can still either tune in by Zoom or electronically. They won't be able to vote. They won't be counted as a quorum, but they can still be part of the discussion and listen in and be a part of the meeting. So we're allowed to do that now. We've just never amended our procedural bylaw to allow that. So I think coming out of this state of emergency, it makes sense to go to that for the future. Any questions on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? That's passed. Anyone opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Item 3.1 is just correspondence. It was just that was supplied to you, some background on the bill. So we don't need to do anything with that. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest on anything on today's agenda? Seeing none. Item 5 is the COVID-19 pandemic community message. So I've got a message I want to read to the community. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin our meeting and talk about what's to come in the days ahead, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on the past couple of months and talk about what we've gone through together as a community. Our lives have changed rapidly in a short amount of time, and it's important we don't lose sight of those who have been most affected. Pinecrest Nursing Home in Bobcaygeon was one of the first long-term care homes in Ontario to be hit hard by COVID-19. Our hearts remain heavy as we think about those who suffered and the families who didn't get a chance to say goodbye to their loved ones in person. And to our friends in Nova Scotia, I want to extend our most sincere condolences to the families and friends of the victims of this terrible attack. Both flags at City Hall and at our Bobcaygeon Service Center have been lowered to half staff in remembrance of all those we have lost to COVID-19 and to the victims and families of the senseless tragedy in Nova Scotia. Today on your screen, you will see white roses, each one for the lives we have lost to COVID-19 in our community. So let's remember that the sacrifices we are being asked to make every day pale in comparison to the tragedy that some families are going through. Our lives may be a little different right now, but everything we do is for the well-being of our community, so that fewer families can experience loss and so that we can continue to support those on the front lines who are out there protecting and working for us day and night. We're going to play a short tribute video showcasing the tremendous love and support that we've been seeing across Kawartha Lakes. Thank you. please join me in a moment of silent reflection. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move into item 5.2 on our from Ron Taylor, the Chief Administrative Officer. It's a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Taylor. You're up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. So it's been a few weeks now since we've last connected, and it's appropriate at this time to provide a touch point with you, with council, on where we're at as a municipality and as a corporation in our response to the pandemic. And then following this item, follow up with some updates on some thinking and recommendations when we start to look at the recovery phase. You will recall that 6 weeks ago, or just over 6 weeks ago, the province declared their state of emergency. That was on March 17th. That overall state of emergency has been in place for approximately 6 weeks, and it's anticipated that it will still be in place, formally at least, for another 2 weeks. I suspect that it will continue on sort of after that May 12th date as well. As of April 28th, so as of today, it remains in effect, as I mentioned. Through that provincial state of emergency, there's a number of orders that the Premier is able to issue within the context will remain in effect currently until May 6th. But I also anticipate that, again, orders will continue on a daily, certainly on a weekly basis, or be extended. One of the other significant milestones that was quite recent was the provincial announcement that all publicly funded schools would remain closed until at least May 31st. So I mentioned that there's a number of orders, and certainly as a local municipality, we're keeping track of those, again, on a daily basis. Some of the ones that are more broad-based or community-focused, so they may not just solely apply to local municipal functions, but other public service. Some of the major ones were prohibition of public events and gatherings, the closure of places of non-essential businesses that has been updated from time to time. The other order from a local impact perspective was the closure of all outdoor recreational amenities. For specific municipal service delivery, there's also a number of orders that are guiding how we're delivering service locally. Some of those include drinking water and sewage. So there's been provincial guidance on how we manage that particular portfolio. There's been various long-term care home directives throughout and quite recently. To give you an order of magnitude, in April alone, up to date, we've had 52 separate directives or orders solely focused on managing long-term care homes and facilities. And so, as you can appreciate, as an employer, but supporter of a long-term care home as well as supporting our community-based privately run homes. It's one area that we have a lot of focus on. In support of our provincial partners, there's enforcement orders. So in some cases, it's our local police services, whether that is Kawartha Lakes Police Service or the OPP. And there also are enforcement orders that our bylaw enforcement office is able to enforce on behalf of the province as well. And we've been doing that regularly as they're issued. One of the recent orders or directives was to allow access to COVID-19 status information for our frontline emergency service providers so that they were aware when they were responding or answering to calls, what the status of a potential patient was or individual. And that was a direct order to manage and maintain the health and safety of our frontline workers. So we've been implementing that as well through our communication systems. There's been a number of orders provincially on work deployment and redeployment on various fronts, and depending on the sector, municipal is no exception. And we've also had several ongoing directives and orders from the province with respect to childcare. Again, I mentioned public schools and also social services, their maintenance and management. We also, the mayor also called a local state of emergency. That was effective on March 24th. The intent of that was to align and be able to mobilize locally and to support our provincial partners in their declaration and the orders that they've issued. Doing this declaration also does allows the mayor to issue additional orders locally where there's local conditions that need our attention or resources as well. Along with that, in the background, we activated our Emergency Operations Center on March 16th, and there was regular meetings already trying to anticipate where we were heading, and also mobilizing and working with our community partners. So that's the venue where we bring together many of our, again, frontline emergency services, and in the case of this pandemic, also the local health unit and our friends at Ross Memorial Hospital. You'll recall as council that we had a regularly scheduled council meeting that was rescheduled for March 19th. Again, right on the heels of the provincial state of emergency. And it was an opportunity to do some business that was pending, but then also to provide some direction to staff to be able to manage the emergency phase of this pandemic, and also can maintain business continuity in doing so. I mentioned that the local declaration occurred on March 24th, and it too also remains in effect and is required for some things that are related to, again, managing the emergency locally. For example, you just passed a bylaw to allow for electronic meetings during a local state of emergency. Our Emergency Operations Center continues to meet multiple times weekly. It is bringing together our city departments, and as I mentioned, not only our emergency services as well, but the mayor represents council through that venue. We also have our police services, as was mentioned, and our health professionals. Our sole focus up to this point, so for the last 6 weeks, has been solely on emergency management and response, and mobilizing and supporting each other through that response. Some of the items that we will focus on regularly in terms of updates are updates from all partners on our people resources, which goes along with if there are any positive tests for COVID-19. We also talk about supplies, and in particular PPE, personal protective equipment, and what those stocks are and are available in order to share, mobilize, do what we need to do as a collective community partner group to support our response phase. And then if there's any immediate partner issues or items that need consideration or partnership from others, then it's an opportunity to solve those problems right in the immediate term. The group has been functioning exceptionally well. All the partners have been very responsive, and I'm certainly very pleased to report that throughout our entire cycle to date and touch points, that all of our partners have been well stocked, well supported, and we've been able to be very responsive in a very short period of time. So as part of the EOC and the local state of emergency, as I mentioned, the municipality through the mayor can issue local emergency orders as well. We have not had to issue any of those locally, so we've been solely focused on complying, informing the community, and implementing or enforcing the provincial orders that have happened to date. The health unit, as a separate and distinct entity, also does have the ability under this local state of emergency to independently issue orders as well. And they have been doing that through their jurisdiction and powers. The main role of the health unit in the immediate term is tracking the cases within our health district or our local area, and they are constantly in contact and communication with our provincial friends and transferring back and forth that information on a daily basis. Their immediate focus also remains solely on case management and response, where there will be identified outbreaks or supports that are needed. And they have been providing through to the municipality a weekly communication, and they maintain their information and updates on their website, and that link is provided on the slide. From a local enforcement perspective, I mentioned that police services and bylaw enforcement have been granted certain enforcement powers through those provincial emergency orders, and we will continue to do and enforce those orders as required. And I would say it's been a fabulous partnership from my perspective of proactive enforcement, but also education. So really, where possible, trying not to take a heavy-handed approach to things, but certainly wanting to educate and get that information out to the community. And that's consistent through both police services in our area and our bylaw enforcement staff. A big part of this is proactive communications, educating and informing the public. And we're inundated, as I know you all appreciate, with communications and updates from everywhere. The mayor has taken a very proactive communications approach to educate locally and inform what's happening. And we've done that not only through outreach videos and press releases, but the mayor also hosts a regular and weekly local media scrum so that any of the local media are able to have access and get the information in a timely manner. And that has served, I think, the municipality and the community extremely well. Examples of signage, we've tried to be as proactive as possible with signage on amenities and in areas where there is some public use. And we've also continued to enforce the message through flyers and pamphlets even out where possible in the community. So while the province, while they continue to issue their orders and operate similar to us in the emergency response sort of phase of this pandemic, I thought it was important to highlight that in the immediate term, they've been quite responsive to municipalities, both in providing guidance and direction, but also in providing immediate emergency funding to support our frontline functions. And what I've listed is just a couple of examples, very specific to our municipal portfolio. They certainly are announcing on a regular basis other emergency funding and supports for all sectors, for all elements within our community. The highlights are the $1.8 million in immediate emergency funding from the province that went through service managers. So we serve as a service manager here in Kawartha Lakes, and for our friends in the county of Haliburton, to flow out emergency support funds for our not-for-profits, for our functions, and for third parties, predominantly focused on food and housing stability and supporting our vulnerable populations. So those funds have already started rolling out to all of our friends and not-for-profits within our community in Haliburton. A few weeks ago, there was also an announcement for $70,000 in 2 installments for emergency funding to all long-term care home facilities throughout the province. So 70,000 represented our share based on our size and scale of Victoria Manor. So some of the local impacts as a result of the various orders and changes to our service, as you know and appreciate, they've been severe. We remain very focused, just like our provincial friends, at maintaining critical and emergency essential services. And so that has changed the landscape dramatically in terms of how we deliver municipal services. So what were some of the things that we did in the immediate term to respond? All of our public facilities, publicly accessible facilities, remain suspended, as well as our recreational amenities. So those are our active playgrounds, play spaces, and areas where there is the likelihood or potential for public gathering. We still do have a very limited footprint for internal operations and work, and we're hopeful, and we are continuing to expand very slowly but surely on that front. Our parks, they're not closed formally, but they are limited specifically and only to passive exercise, walking, that type of activity. Again, that's in alignment with the provincial order to prohibit gatherings of beyond 5 people at the current time. And so we've also changed the way we've done other business, like our curbside waste collection and our leaf and yard waste pickup. So some of the things that we've tried to do while respecting these different orders, while we restrict public access in the immediate term to our landfills, we've expanded the amount and number of waste and bags that all residents are able to put out at curbside. And our belief is that that's the sort of safest and easiest way to continue to collect waste, but also to expand, recognizing that we need to continue to do that operation. Similarly, our leaf and yard waste program, which was originally planned for June, those dates will continue tentatively, but we've also increased or added an additional cycle that actually will be happening at the beginning of May. Some of the other things that have impacted our local service in the immediate term are community events and gatherings. We've made the decision because, as I'm sure you can appreciate, we can't just turn a light switch on. There's a lot of planning and organizing and volunteer mobilization or staff or municipal resources that are needed to plan and ready for events. And so we've had to make the hard decision to suspend and discourage those types of events in the community. At this point, we've used June 30th as our target date. And as you can appreciate, and I know many throughout the municipality, even Canada Day, we're recommending that those events take place in a different manner, recognizing that we're not going to be able to gather like we used to, at least in the immediate term. Beyond July 1st, we haven't made any formal decisions or recommendations to council, to you, with respect to what our service delivery and what our public service and gathering will look like for the summer months. But it is something that we are putting attention to in the immediate term in the next couple of weeks. not just for events and gatherings, but also now some of our traditional summer programming and summer services, whether those are summer camps, for example. And it's not just us, it'll be other providers and not-for-profits out there that also deliver these summer-focused services, whether they're camps or sporting type team events. So stay tuned for that. We're looking at that sort of next cycle in the coming weeks. I mentioned our corporate response. Once the state of emergencies were announced, our focus was very rapid and quick to get into what I term a critical and emergency essential service function. And I've listed what some of those critical or essential services are that we're maintaining and managing. Again, some of them on an emergency basis. All emergency services definitely will continue and have been continuing full speed ahead, and they've been doing a commendable job over the last 6 weeks. Our local social services and our housing for vulnerable residents needs to continue. And so staff and our resources continue to be put towards those functions and cycles, predominantly through our human services divisions and department. I mentioned our Victoria Manor long-term care home is top priority in looking at managing and making sure that all of their appropriate resources and supplies and resourcing are available to them. Water and wastewater operations have continued and will continue, status quo. Waste collection and recycling, I already mentioned, has not been suspended. We have changed a little bit how we've done the business, and we are looking towards, in the coming weeks, how we can expand on that footprint as well. In a very short time, in 6 weeks, it's sad to say that winter control was still top of mind, at least when the state of emergency was first issued. We did have a couple of winter events in that mid to late March timeframe. And so we did have staff and crews focused on that and responded as normal. And we continue also through our public works group to respond predominantly on an emergency basis on any road, bridge, or culvert repairs and maintenance that are needed. We continue to operate transit locally in Lindsay. It is on a limited basis and by appointment only, but we wanted to maintain and ensure that that service was still available, again, for critical movements and functions, for appointments and for food. And our utility locates is another service that we need to continue to operate so that our utility partners can continue on to maintain, expand on any of those utilities and critical infrastructure supporting our community. So you'll recall, I mentioned March 19th was our last regular council meeting. And at that meeting, you delegated some authority to me, anticipating that we were going into a local state of emergency. And really the focus on that delegation was for business continuity, the ability to procure on an emergency basis and shift our budgets where necessary to make sure that we had a good response. And also looking at decision-making for staff redeployment or deployments, but also in-term service delivery. So a number of items that I mentioned to you in the previous slides, we've had to make those decisions at the moment, again, and in conformity and in keeping with provincial orders as best we can and with the resources that we have available to us. I mentioned we continue to focus solely on emergency response and critical service delivery, and some of those elements that are considered with those orders. Over the last certainly week or two, but I would suggest even after over several weeks, we've been slowly shifting our minds towards business recovery and how we can start to recover not just corporately and expanding out on our service footprint, but also helping to assist our community and their recovery in the coming weeks and months. So what have we done? What are some of the things that we did in the immediate term now from a corporate perspective? Similar to the EOC function that I mentioned, we also have regular touch points with all departments multiple times weekly to make sure that we are responsive, that there aren't barriers. If there are any public pressures or issues, that we're able to be responsive in a very short order and period of time as best we can. At the same time that we're again focused on critical and essential, we certainly appreciate that the municipality in normal operations and times delivers over 200 services and programs. And so we can't take our eye off those as well. We need to make sure that we're either looking at how we can recover and expand on those over the coming weeks, and or maintaining them while still in an emergency state, making sure that the safety and health of our staff and of the public are top of mind and respected. We've done a number of staff redeployments in the immediate term. So we're moving and shifting staff where it's feasible, where there's skill sets, mainly to help support the resources that, as you can appreciate, are becoming strained over a 6-week time period. And so we want to make sure that some of that additional support function is shifted to our front lines. And we've done that, I think, quite successfully. We've had to make some hard decisions with respect to staffing and resources. The main one being staff layoffs. And we had to make that decision, recognizing that we weren't going to be offering some seasonal programs, and certainly that our service footprint had shrunk in the immediate term. So we laid off almost 300 staff, all of them being either permanent part-time, contractual, or seasonal employees. And at the same time, it allowed for then our redeployments from other areas of our full-time staff, as I mentioned before, to our other critical functions. We also offered voluntary leave to any of our staff that wanted to leverage or take advantage of any of the upper levels of government programs that were out there, or certainly to deal with personal and family issues as well. And we had about an additional 40 staff, a little over 40, that also opted out for voluntary leaves under various contexts. And we also had to make the hard decision, not knowing what seasonality services we were going to be delivering, that we suspended any and all vacancy fills or hiring programs or processes until we knew where we were heading down the line. Some of the things that we've done, and again, I hope you appreciate, I'm sure you do, that we're quite a large organization and we're managing a very broad-based portfolio. I want to take the opportunity to sort of commend all of our staff, and I want to thank Council for your support over the last 6 weeks in really mobilizing a massive machine that we manage. And I hope and think we've done a great job at least trying to be responsive and really keeping our eye on the critical and essential service delivery. We've done some massive shifts on work at home and how that's done. We've expanded on our technology footprint. We've limited, and we still continue to have very limited access to our facilities. That's deliberate in order to make sure that we're respecting physical separation and distancing. Today is our first, as the mayor mentioned, our electronic council meeting, and we're hoping that in the coming month and months, we'll be able to expand on that, not just for council, but other committee functions as well. But again, as you can appreciate, we need to do it so that it's safe. But I think more importantly, we need to make sure that the public interaction and interface element is top of mind and accommodated through those meetings, which is really the main purpose for them. So we want to make sure we get it right and spend some time in the coming weeks to provide you with some guidance on that direction. We have a lot of staff that are out and about in the community, whether they're inspecting or patrolling or just educating. And it's not just our enforcement, as I mentioned, with police and our bylaw, but it's also our park staff that are looking at how things are going in our parks. It's our road staff, making sure that we don't have sort of critical or emergency breakdowns in our infrastructure. It's also our building inspection staff, as well as our engineering and assets group looking at construction inspection and oversight. We need to make sure that as we're doing business and we're asking the public to do things, that we have the proper resources also doing oversight and inspection so that our contractors and our third parties are also managing and functioning properly. Signage, education, and communications, again, continue to be a focus, and we're trying to use every platform available to us to be able to keep the community informed. And we are continuing to access our files to look at starting to get back to business. I still call it unusual, but more business as usual. Whether that's, again, active files that need approvals of council or staff, but also just other functions like our provincial offenses, any bylaw enforcement complaints, inquiries, issues, and legal and risk management functions. So I'm going to conclude, Mr. Mayor, with that overview of sort of our response to date. And we're going to continue to rely on the orders and the direction from the province, but also, again, as I mentioned, starting to look at slowly and gradually and wherever feasible and appropriate to expand on our business footprint, not only to try to get back to a corporate business recovery mode or continuity, but also to be ready and prepared for when we need to support our community and our businesses out there. So I've challenged all of our staff in every department to look at and revise our 2020 work plans in their entirety, with the main lens being pandemic recovery and what does that look like from a programming perspective, from an approvals perspective, and from a financial perspective. And so with that financial note, we're looking at every budget line by line. We are operating currently, as I mentioned, in emergency mode. So any non-essential expenditure has been suspended. Only critical capital budgets, projects right now have been continued or maintained. And we are going to be looking line by line, as I mentioned, and bringing an update to you at the May 26th council meeting with some better updates on what is our financial position up to that point and some recommendations on how we should be looking and shifting our investments in 2020, again, with that continued focus on emergency response and then recovery down the line. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to answer any questions that you or council may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I appreciate that. I'll just ask for a motion from council that the verbal report from Ron Taylor, Chief Administration Officer, regarding the pandemic response update be received. Councillor Vale, seconded by Councillor Elmsley. Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Taylor on the presentation? Councillor Vale, you moved it. Do you have any questions? Councillor Elmsley, and as a seconder, you're good. Councillor Dunn, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question through you to the CAO. He mentioned projects that were being suspended. I'm just wondering if you could give me a couple examples, and I guess two that I've got an interest in would be the cultural study for a cultural center, and because that was a $50,000 budget item, and one on sidewalks and trails and so on and so forth. Are they among the ones you've temporarily suspended, or can you give me comments on those?
CAO, can you comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the councillor. So we've suspended our initial sort of suspension of almost all projects was solely in alignment with provincial orders. So unless the work was critical or essential on the provincial lists, we suspended them. So that was sort of the first sort of approach. The secondary approach was in the early part of the state of emergency, we didn't want to overcommit or spend on any projects until we knew better what our financial position was going to be and how we should be shifting and moving. So some of the examples, studies in particular, we did not proceed in the immediate term. We are looking at those right now. There are some that are funded by various sources or solely for those purposes. The other balancing act is that in the immediate term, when the emergency was called, we also wanted to make sure that our procurement process was going to be fair and open. So we were sensing that a lot of businesses, a lot of consultants, a lot of contractors, at least in the first couple of weeks, weren't even in a position to respond or bid to any of our tenders or RFPs. So that was the other reason for suspending it, so that we could look at properly doing a process. The next phase, over the next 2 weeks, I have asked our procurement group to provide me with recommendations of those other priority projects that make sense, that align with the critical and essential studies, or just functions and purchases. And then at the May 26th meeting, we're going to come to you with a broader based sort of list of projects that potentially we should be considering either deferring or canceling for a number of reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Ashmore, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the CAO. Two quick questions. The state of emergency, so if it comes off, if the provincial government takes it off on the 12th of May, which is 2 weeks from now, will we be following that, or what is the plan for that? And who makes the call whether we continue on that state of emergency?
I could probably answer that for you,
You can
Councillor.
answer, sure.
I declared the local state of emergency in alignment with the provincial state of emergency. I think it's certainly prudent if we keep going at that point, just to keep everybody on the same page and the importance of what we're doing. It would fully be my intent when the provincial state of emergency, we would have a good look at our local situation, and I would assume that we would, if they're lifting their state of emergency at some point, we would probably try to align our state of emergency to be lifted at the same time, so we can sort of all move forward together. So there's a lot of what's and ifs in that statement as we move forward, but that would certainly be the plan moving forward.
And finally, the CAO said we made the decision. Like, just wondering who we is. That's yourself and the CAO. When he refers to we made the decision to do this and that. I just want to know who we is. Just for clarification. I assume it's yourself.
It depends what you're referring to. I mean, I'll ask the CAO to comment, but for the local state of emergency, I made that decision as the head of the municipality. That was my decision, obviously in consultation with the EOC and the CAO and as many people as I could. I talked to council about it beforehand. Everybody was informed, but it was my decision. Some of the other decisions under delegated authority were part of the CAO made. Other decisions were made regarding, for instance, increased bag pickup, which were really just made for questions and comments. We were having conversations with council over the last few weeks, update sessions where we're having discussions, any questions, what were some of the wants and needs that you were hearing in the community. I was taking that information, forwarding it on to staff and the CAO. So, you know, it depends on the decision. You'd have to be a bit more specific, but I think we tried to get involved and make as many decisions as we could where appropriate, but there was other situations that had to be made, and they were made on a more individual level. So
Yeah.
I'll ask the CAO if he has anything to add to that. Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, when I referred to we, I think similar to the mayor's comments, so it did depend on the circumstances. The delegated authority that came through to me in the immediate term wasn't so much to sort of make broad-based and sweeping decisions. It was really the point that I was making about service changes in the immediate term. And so by extension, those decisions were made through me with respect to our budgets and or our staffing and redeployment. The mayor mentioned that any of our other decisions have almost solely been made as being in compliance with the provincial orders, or at least our interpretation of those provincial orders, and that's how we have responded. I think just to echo the mayor's message or his conclusionary remark, which was these aren't decisions that are made lightly and certainly not in a vacuum. And I do thank and appreciate not just the mayor, but all of council. He mentioned those touch points. You're the ones that have been able to provide sort of ears on the ground, what you're hearing from the public. And that's what's also informing as best we can in the circumstances, those decisions. Thank you.
Are you good? Good with that?
Yep.
Thank you. Any further questions on the presentation? Okay, we have a motion to receive. I'll call the question. All in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Item 5.3 we'll move down to is the pandemic recovery update. Ron Taylor, Chief Administration Officer, that the verbal report from Ron Taylor, CAO. Oh, that's the motion to receive. So I'll turn it over to the CAO to give us an update on the pandemic recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to council. So as I mentioned, we are laser focused on our critical and emergency response in the immediate term. But having said that, as the local municipal government, we would be remiss if we weren't looking proactively to the future and the recovery phase of this incident. Not only recovery, again, from a corporate perspective, but also community, and really being a leader in that healing and recovery of our businesses and all of the residents out there. I mentioned in my previous presentation that we are continuing to operate under provincial state of emergency. That remains in effect now and until at least May 12th. I'm quite certain that that date will be extended, but what orders are issued under that, although they remain in effect until May 6th, I think you're going to see some changes, either pulling back on certain orders from the province or also ramping up and prohibiting further functions in certain elements of the community, long-term care homes, for example. These orders are issued regularly on a daily basis and a weekly basis, and I mentioned that we're tracking those, and wherever required as a municipal entity, we're complying fully and also educating the public and informing them of those orders and implications. One milestone that actually occurred just yesterday was a provincial release of a framework for reopening our province. It was a roadmap that was published and put out by the provincial government to start to at least begin the conversation and the map as to how the province might approach the recovery phase of this pandemic. And so it is fresh, hot off the press. We've been able to review that document on a preliminary basis. It really is, at least in my mind, in alignment with our local response to date and our continued approach which I think is to be slow and steady. We're gonna move things as we know and we have the right information, if the right testing is there, and that the safety precautions or protocols are in place to be able to continue to expand out. They also reiterated in that particular plan that they're looking at about a 2 to 4 week business cycle where phases or expansion to service and functions will occur. And that 2 to 4 weeks allows for sort of looking at what are the implications, what are the impacts of certain decisions, and then having the ability potentially to revisit and either continue on, retract, or expand on it. And I think it's a prudent approach, at least in the immediate term, and one that we're at least taking on or mirroring locally. We're not aware, there's been some questions just with respect to federal or provincial funding or supports directed specifically to municipalities, mainly on the recovery phase. Right now, any of those supports are unknown. A number of the upper levels have been lobbied actively, or municipalities are approaching them either through FCM with the federal audience, or locally through AMO and other municipal associations, where they're starting to provide recommendations to those levels of government on how municipalities may be supported in the coming months. There have been some announcements, though, focused as an employer on programs, whether they're emergency programs or top-up type programs, or employee funded programs that are, again, available to some of our functions here at the local level. But for the most part, it's very unclear at this point, at least, where we're heading from a financial support perspective from the upper levels of government. As we're continuing on, we are very focused on our financials and what is the impact of this pandemic in the immediate term. I want to make sure that we are consistently responsive and ready, and if we need to procure resources, be that people, be that protective equipment, or be that just general supplies in order to do the critical and essential functions properly, we've been able to mobilize and shift in very short order. And I will commend for all of the departments to date. They've actually been able to do that and manage that in our current budget envelopes and footprint. So we're not seeing sort of some dramatic increased expenditure. We certainly are shifting certain budgets, again, to procuring supplies and PPE, but we are looking at strategies and ways to offset that expenditure as well. We're reviewing sort of now, it's been 6 weeks. What is the impact going to be now more broadly on our budgets? So that applies to our revenues that come in. As you can appreciate, about half of our overall budgets are tax-based support. And so we have to look at some cash flowing and issues related to that, and the ability to pay and sustainability of the broader community. There's revenue losses in many of our program areas, whether that's in our recreation, licensing, user fees, any of those items, even fines, penalties, and so on. We've either made the decision to suspend some of those, or they've been dramatically reduced just based solely on how the community is operating at the current time. In delivering services, we also have to, again, be very focused on how we're delivering them. They have to be compliant with all the health and safety orders that are out there. And so with physical distancing, additional PPE requirements, limitations to the public in even accessing us and interacting with us. They have also changed our service delivery. In some cases, there's been expenses that have been at a premium. I would suggest they're well worth the investment in order to, again, keep people safe, but also to keep the business functioning and running, both for us and for the public. Some financial decisions we've also made. I mentioned in my previous presentation, we have had to do some immediate staff layoffs, recognizing that some of those functions and supports weren't happening or they were seasonal in nature. We've done a number of redeployments and shifted staff around so that we can maximize our people footprint. We've reduced and actually suspended all of our term non-essential spending. And we are now looking at, in the next cycle, over the next 2 to 4 weeks, a line-by-line review of our budgets with a goal of making recommendations to council when we start to look fully at the recovery phase, how we should be managing our 2020 investments and budgets. Some of the things that we've done in the very immediate term, and I certainly appreciate that when we're in our response phase of things, that there's not a lot that we can do because we're so focused on the response side of things. But through council, there was a decision to make or to defer the interim and final 2020 tax payments and defer them by 60 days. We also waived penalties and late charges that are associated with utility payments beyond those due dates. And as I mentioned, we're also on a weekly basis, our finance staff are monitoring and auditing our books to make sure that our cash flow remains viable and healthy, and to make sure that we're in the proper position to recover and to accelerate that recovery where best possible. So internally, we've established 3 separate and distinct recovery teams that are staff populated, again, so that we can come back to you. I mentioned the financial focus, and that is ongoing, and that will be a major update that we provide later on in May. We need to stay focused, so we want to make sure that we have a recovery strategy for our people, our staff, and with that, sort of how we're going to be asking our staff to deliver services. And in many areas, we're going to be delivering them quite different. So we need to make sure that the proper resources and people and skill sets are there and available. And business continuity. We have a stable business continuity plan already in the city. But with this pandemic event, we would be short-sighted if we didn't learn from this and we didn't expand on some of the immediate learning that we've had to do in broadening our business continuity plan. And so it really has forced us internally to look very closely at what is critical and essential service, and also other functions that we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think by keeping our eye on this, when we get deeper into the recovery phase, we'll be able to provide some good recommendations to council on core service maintenance and how we maybe should be looking at services and service delivery a little bit different. Through the mayor over the last couple of weeks and through inputs from all of you from council, top of mind, I'll say throughout the community and the public, is getting to the next phase and recovery. And I want to be very clear, and I think everybody shares, we're certainly not going to do it at the expense of response and of public and or staff health and safety. But having said that, it is an important element in emergency response and planning that we start to look at recovery and mobilizing And in this case, it's not a focused event that has a timeline that's clear, that has maybe a geography or a very confined impact. This is broad-based. This is across our entire municipality. And so we need to look at even how we support and recover differently. And so through advice from the mayor and from council, we thought that we really should be putting a lot of energy and resources to thinking about economic recovery and focus, and also our community recovery and how that might look. So you will see later on the agenda, we've provided 2 draft terms of reference, but really just concepts at this point. And we would be asking later in the agenda for council to endorse and approve those, and direct staff to start to reach out to partners throughout the community, and then also work through you, finalize and formalize these task forces at our next meeting, your meeting in May, and then get on with the business of looking at mobilizing and recovery to the best that we can. So I'll speak briefly on the Economic Recovery Task Force. The intent is really, again, to look at this from a community recovery perspective, broad-based. So we want to look at how we can support local businesses and recovery where we can. We want to look at our building and development sectors and industry, and how we can support and streamline those areas as well. We also want to look at infrastructure stimulus, as we're talking regularly with our upper levels of government, us as a local municipality, and also those other public sector service providers do stimulate the economy with construction and with projects. And so I think at all levels, we should also be looking at prioritizing projects that are going to do just that, bring jobs in the immediate term. We also want to have a focus, or recommend that we focus on vulnerable sectors. So now looking at it through a local lens, we certainly are very reliant and active in tourism and agriculture here in City of Kawartha Lakes, among others. And so we want to make sure that we're taking a sector approach as well, and that we are mobilizing, but also resourcing specifically to help support those specific sectors as best we can. One of the things that I've challenged staff to do, and will be another update at your meeting May 26th, will be a listing and prioritizing what those projects may look like. Again, whether they're capital projects that we're implementing, or whether they're planning and development applications and projects that I deem or term shovel ready in this calendar year. Again, the goal is going to be, wherever we can as a municipality, let's try to stimulate the development and construction industries and jobs. And one of the things we want to do later this week is launch a very focused business survey to our local business community to understand, engage local impact of this pandemic, and what are they feeling, what are they hearing, what do they need from all levels of government for support and recovery moving forward. The second focus that we need to keep our eyes on in the coming months to be, in my opinion, successful in community recovery is looking at our not-for-profits, connecting our community service providers that are out there, and really supporting them. They're the ones that are also supporting all of the residents, all of our vulnerable communities, and our health frontline workers. So we want to focus on recovery for health and human service sectors, whether they're government-led or run, or not-for-profit-led or run. We want to look at community safety and well-being. So that is something that we were starting to mobilize but we want to continue on with that theme. But again, through this recovery lens, and as we mobilize all of our community partners out there, we want to make sure that we keep our eye not just on health, recovery, but also just overall community safety and resident health. Again, I mentioned vulnerable residents will remain a focus, and whether that's through food and housing security or also other social service supports, it's critical that we connect those groups and that our residents understand the multitude of support services and functions that are out there already. Sustainability for our not-for-profits. So we want to make sure, I mentioned, for example, in my previous presentation, emergency funding that came from the province that we want to flow through these not-for-profits so that they are sustainable and can be responsive. So our food banks, for example, need stable and sustainable funding. And so some of that has already happened, but we also want to look at it ongoing in a recovery mode or lens. One of the things that I know the mayor has certainly mentioned and shared on an ongoing basis is just an overwhelming stepping up in support from third parties, community organizations throughout Kawartha Lakes. Again, whether there's cottage associations, community groups, everything from buildings to supplies to volunteers have all been offered. And I certainly won't speak directly for the mayor, but it certainly is appreciated. And I think there's a strong place in the community healing phase and recovery where we can leverage and mobilize all of that kind volunteer support and offering. And one of the other things we want to do, as I mentioned, is really just expose all of the collective community supports that are already out there and will be leaned on and required to get us to full recovery stage. So next steps in recovery, as I mentioned on the agenda later today, is a recommendation for council to endorse the establishment of these two task forces, and we'll go away and do our homework in the coming weeks and start to connect those groups that I think can best help overall those recovery efforts. We're going to reach out to everybody as best we can, and then we'll bring that back to you, Mr. Mayor, at the May 26th council meeting. And so with that, I'll conclude, and again, happy to answer any questions that you may have with respect to recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor. Appreciate that. So can I get a motion that the verbal report from Ron Taylor, CAO, regarding the pandemic recovery update be received, please? Councillor O'Reilly and Councillor Dunn. Councillor O'Reilly, do you have any questions?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Ron. At some point, we don't have it today, but are we going to get an update on the 1.8 million from Director Sutherland?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. We will provide an update in terms of the overall expenditure. I am aware of the sort of immediate recommended sort of flow out. We did do a press release, I'm going to say about a week ago, might have been 2 weeks ago, where we did highlight some of those particular groups and organizations that our service manager reached out to that required the funding. But I'd be more than happy to provide to council at a later date the exhaustive list of those investments.
Okay. Councillor Dunn, you seconded it. Do you have any questions?
No, I'm fine, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Yeo, you had a question. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. I have a just one question really. When we say we're looking at the budget and there's some things that might get delayed and stuff, keeping in mind that if we want to stimulate the economy, we want to be very careful that we don't cut too many projects, and because it'd be taking work away from people who otherwise might desperately need it in this time.
Is that a question for the CAO? Is that you're looking for clarification?
Yeah, just clarification or just the knowledge that we're looking at that in that vein.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. CAO, do you want to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to the councillor. Great question or clarification that, again, decisions in the very immediate term were more aligned with the essential or critical provincial order that was out there. So we were constrained from proceeding with any procurement beyond those essential functions. I would agree and sort of echo your comments that the recommendations that we want to bring forward are to do exactly what you're suggesting. Wherever possible and where we can, we want to put forward capital projects that are going to stimulate the economy and jobs this year. The only thing I would temper it with is making sure that we can afford to do it broad-based. So I'm thinking of more what I would just deem maybe non-essential capital functions, but the highest priority will be those that contribute to recovery and to job creation in 2020.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that, Councillor Yeo, that in discussion I've had with our provincial counterpart of infrastructure, Laurie Scott, she's made it very clear that her and her federal counterpart are looking at infrastructure projects that will get people back to work moving forward for the balance of the year as well. So I think when we get those projects in front of us, that'll align pretty well with what we want to do. And I think all three governments are on the same page as far as what projects can we put in place quickly and get as many people back to work as we can to try and bring some sense of normalcy back to what's been going on. So I think everybody's on board with the same comments.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions regarding the presentation? Seeing none, we have a motion to receive. All in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. We'll move into item 5.4, which is the Economic Recovery Task Force in terms of reference. I think it's a real quick overview from our CAO, a 30-second overview. That wasn't a direction, just a suggestion, sir. And then we have a motion. So I'll let Ron, our CAO, give us a quick overview, and then there's a motion there, and we'll go from there. So go ahead, Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And through you, I will be brief because in the previous presentations, I did introduce these two concepts. I'll just simply reiterate that I think these are both important initiatives. And certainly I will again remind or repeat that this is coming through loud and clear from the mayor, from council, and from community members that they are all looking to us for leadership in the recovery phases of our economy, and anywhere and everywhere that we can help support that. We want to make sure that we're responsive and can do that in an appropriate manner. So staff have provided a very broad-based draft terms of reference of what that recovery task force may look like. I don't believe that there's the necessity for making any appointments or any major decisions on it today, but wanted to make sure, or at least poll council, that we were in the right direction. If there's any other elements that the task force scope of work you think should be included, we'll make sure to document that and then bring back a more formal terms of reference that you can launch at your May 26th meeting. And I think it speaks for itself in terms of what the recommended focus at least could be. But I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, sir. So the motion that we have is that the verbal report from Ron Taylor, CAO, regarding an economic recovery task force be received, and that an economic recovery task force be established, and that staff are directed to prepare the economic recovery task force terms of reference, and that the final terms of reference and update to council on interested stakeholders and volunteers be provided at the May 26th council meeting. So if I can get a mover and a seconder, we'll see if there's any questions. Councillor Yeo, you'll move that. Councillor Seymour Fagan, you'll second that. Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Yeo, would you like to speak to it?
No, I think my main question was already answered, and I look forward to it.
Thank you. Councillor Seymour Fagan, you seconded it. Do you want to speak to it?
No, I just think it's a great plan to move forward, and I'm looking forward forward as well.
Yeah, and this gives staff the proper direction to sort of put the procedures and policies and ground up some people, and then we'll make those decisions at the May 26th council meeting. Are there any questions regarding the motion that was presented on the floor? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. So item 5.5 is the land use planning interim procedures. Again, Ron Taylor, the CAO, and I can give you a quick update and Ron can add to it. This is basically, we're trying to change some of the interim procedures, or we want to change the interim procedures so that the final reports that come to our planning committee that are simply recommendations made to council, that we will bring those directly to council in the interim. Number one, to speed up the process. Number two, to simplify the process and to try and maintain our distancing and our protocols and stuff. But because they are recommendations to council, we would like to sort of separate the committee and the public portion of any planning meetings that need to take place. We'll still go through the PAC committee, and we'll set that up virtual if we can, because we've changed the procedural bylaw to do that. So any public meetings will still go through the PAC committee, because we have to have a public presence there. And I think that goes to part of Councillor Dunn's question earlier about the process and the public participation, but we'll get clarity on that. And then what we want to do is separate any final reports and recommendations from our staff that are coming to the PAC committee and then being recommended to council will just come directly to council to try and get us a little bit caught up, speed up the process, so that when the province says some of these projects can actually get back to work, we're a little bit further ahead in the process. So I don't know if the CAO has anything you want to add to that, Ron, but you're good? We've covered it. So Ron says no, unless there's any questions. That's the gist of the motion. Is there any questions on sort of the outline, and then I'll read the motion? Councillor Ashmore, go ahead.
Thanks. Just through you to Ron, through the CAO, does that apply to anybody who's already in the queue for a development, whether it's big or small? Who does it apply to? Like, is there a certain date that they had their application in, or how will it work to expedite their development?
I'll turn it over to Ron, CAO. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. So generally, it will apply to any planning applications that have already had their statutory public meeting under the Act. And as the Mayor said, it's so that now, once that public process has gone through, it's the ability to simply bring staff recommendations forward directly to council, as opposed to a two-step process which went through the PAC committee first. I mentioned in a previous presentation, we are doing the process now of prioritizing developments, projects. I'm not sure I would suggest that time is the only factor. I think the lens that I've asked staff to look through first and foremost is bringing forward as quickly as possible recommendations for developments, big or small, that are ready to go and that can be accomplished or achieved this year, and or will stimulate either the economy or job creation in 2020.
Okay, Councillor Ashmore, is that good?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Okay. So I've got a motion here that the memo from Chris Marshall, Director of Development Services, regarding land use planning interim procedures be received, and that in order to expedite planning decisions due to the declaration of emergency, provincial and local, and to protect public health and safety, Council authorizes an interim modification to the Planning Advisory Committee's terms of reference that will provide for planning applications to be forwarded directly to Council for consideration and approval. If I get a mover and a seconder for that, and see if there's any questions. Councillor O'Reilly will move that. Councillor Yo, you'll second that. Thank you. Are there any questions, comments regarding that? Councillor O'Reilly, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. I think these are great first interim steps, as CAO Mr. Taylor has said. I think it's also very important too that we keep the PAC members, not only the members of council, but the public members in the loop. And as Ron said, we're going to have further update as we go on towards the May meeting, and he's going to prioritize. He said he mentioned the items that he thinks that have to be dealt with, and I think Dean, you and Ron, you certainly described what's going to happen going forward.
Thank you, Councillor. And I'll just advise Council that the Planning Committee, the public members were advised of this motion coming forward, and we haven't received any comments from any of them, you know, to the negative or the positive. So I think they completely understand. Councillor Yo, go ahead.
Yeah, and while we're talking about planning, I just want to make sure, and I know I've got a response from you and the CAO, but I want to make sure that I understand the director is using all aspects of the Planning Act to speed up any minor issues and stuff that can be sped up, using his powers under the Act to streamline the process in some issues, because this is a perfect opportunity to get rid of some backlog.
Agree. Thank you. I can confirm that what is allowable to be within his authority, he is approving. If they're ready to be approved, was the information I received. But I'll ask the CAO if he's got anything to add to that. Go ahead, Ron.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, thank you. Yes, we are sort of through staff delegated authority, leveraging any and all as best we can. Also pleased at the same time that we've been able to dramatically expand, I'll say, our resources and our footprint in planning and in building, whether that's sort of access out to our remote offices and buildings as well, starting to do inspections more remotely, but again, leveraging that delegated authority to do some streamlined approvals in the immediate term. One recent example, we just had a touch point or an update even on draft plan of approval of subdivisions, and looking at proactively extending out lapsing provisions, recognizing that we are obviously in a pandemic circumstance and the industry out there isn't as responsive as normal. So again, another example of how we're trying to use delegated authority. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions on the motion on the floor? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Anyone opposed? That passes. Thank you. So we'll move into item 5.6, which is the Community Pandemic Recovery Task Force. In terms of reference for the Community Recovery Task Force, which is very similar to the Economic Recovery Task Force, same motion. And again, I'll ask our CAO just to give us a quick update. I think it was mostly gone over in the previous presentation, but a quick update, and then we'll get a motion moving forward on that. So over to you, CAO. You're on mute, Mr. CAO. You need to unmute.
I thought that was at the mayor's pleasure to mute when needed. Through you, Mr. Mayor, apologize for that. So I talked about the economic recovery at the same time and simultaneously. Certainly in the coming months, we need to have an equal sort of focus and attention to our community partners, our community service providers that are out there across a broad spectrum, whether it's health, human services, community services, and so on. So this is another recommended task force that council would lead and take on. We did provide a draft task force terms of reference, and really it's to connect those community partners and mobilize and share our collective resources to be able to focus on predominantly those vulnerable residents, or certainly those areas, again, of community and social supports, whether it's food and housing security, or just simply, again, helping our not-for-profits to recover and get back to some normalcy in the coming months. Happy to answer any questions that you have. Very similarly, if we get the direction today, we would bring back to you at the May meeting more details and an update on our outreach to the various partners locally. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll just get a motion and then we'll see if there's any questions or comments that the verbal report from Ron Taylor, CAO, regarding a community pandemic recovery task force be received, that a community pandemic recovery task force be established, and that staff are directed to prepare the community pandemic recovery task force terms of reference, and that the final terms of reference and update to council on interested stakeholders and volunteers be provided at the May 26th council meeting. If I can get a mover and a seconder, Council Elmsley, you'll move that. Councillor Richardson, you'll second that. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Elmsley, do you want to comment on it?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Richardson, you seconded it. Do you have anything you want to add?
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to just make a comment, just seeing us migrate through this. It's the unknown and we've done it together. And I know our community partners have been stepping up, and it's been wonderful to see what kind of volunteers and what they have been doing in our community. So I think this next step is going to be really critical when we start rolling into recovery mode.
Agree. Thank you. Councillor Ashmore, you had a question?
Just one question, please. And it was a statistic that I heard this morning. There were 100,000 people in Ontario that are there's a backlog of surgeries. I don't know how many there are here in City Kawartha Lakes, but these people don't have the luxury of time. We're talking about another month into the end of May. Are we going to be working with the hospital or Ministry of Health to kind of, kickstart this and get these surgeries back, the hospitals back? Because people don't have time. And there's a lot of people out there that are really worried health-wise. I know we have the pandemic mode that we're in, but there's a lot of other things that are backlogging up right now. And the people are waiting for some answers on that in our healthcare system.
Yes, no, I agree. And I've actually had that conversation with our MPP, Laurie Scott. That decision to put off elective surgeries, as you know, was a provincial decision. We are lobbying them. We have been lobbying them hard to recognize that it is some concern moving forward. And I know the MPPs and the province knows that at the same time. It's not something that can be put on hold forever. And how are we possibly going to catch up when it is? So again, it's up to the province to sort of release that moving forward. They, I think, fully recognize the challenges ahead of them, and hopefully in the near future, with the hospitals not seeing the surge, I think they were preparing for the big surge. They're not seeing that surge, and perhaps they're just looking at a little more time. And when they recognize that, that those empty beds and those staff that they put aside for the surge that hopefully isn't coming, they can start reallocating some of those staff back to some of these surgeries that are backing up quickly. I agree with you, but I can assure you I've had that conversation with our MPP, and she feels the exact same way that we do, and she's been taking that forward to the cabinet table. So,
great, thank you.
Concern for all of us. Thank you for that question. Any other questions on the motion? Seeing none, we have a mover and a seconder. I'll call the question. All in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. That's it for our reports. Bylaws. I just need a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of a special council meeting of April 28th, 2020. That a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of our special council meeting today, Tuesday, April 28th, be read a first, second, and third time, passed, numbered, signed, and the corporate seal attached. Need a mover and a seconder. Councillor Vale, Councillor Dunn. Any questions, comments? All in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. And then I need our next scheduled meeting will be May 26th. We'll get clarification on a few things for that meeting. The scope and setup of that meeting is unknown at that time. We'll see what direction we're heading, but we will certainly keep you updated as we have been and keep you posted on the situation moving forward. Thank you all for tuning in today. I think we accomplished some business. I know May will be a much more regular council meeting where we can deal with some issues that have been put on the back burner for quite a while and make some decisions and start moving some things forward outside of our emergency processes. So with that said, I'll just ask for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Yeo, you'll move a motion to adjourn, seconded by Councillor Elmsley. Any questions or comments on the motion to adjourn? All in favor? Anyone opposed? Motion passes. We are adjourned. Thanks, folks. Have a good evening.